Hashima Island. 1. Salt extraction from the evaporation of seawater was an important product in Japan for many centuries. To obtain the salt, the manufacturers of the inner sea of Seto used wood rich in resin from their pine forests for combustion. In the early 18th century this material became scarce, so the people of Takashima Island saw an opportunity to sell them mineral coal for the same purpose. 2. In the case of islands, coal is usually originated by the decomposition of plants accumulated in shallow coastal areas. The flooded plants are covered in sand and clay that protects them from the air. Subsequently, anaerobic bacteria start what will be a slow transformation, turning them into this non-renewable material rich in carbon and highly combustible. As it is well known, this process took place during the Carboniferous period, between 299 and 359 million years ago. 3. The people of Takashima Island, accustomed to extract superficial coal from their land to use it as domestic fuel, took advantage of the new shipping routes to sell coal to replace pine wood. Due to this, superficial extraction became insufficient as well as their symmetrical social structure. 4. The Takahori family, who had feudal domain on the island, noting that exporting coal was such a profitable business, usurped the islanders' land administration rights. The islanders became subcontractors and labor at their service. This way mineral coal production became a pillar in the island's economy. This happened during the decade of 1850, which coincided with Japan's aperture to the world and the moment in which Great Britain, the United States and other countries began to use steam engines for their ships, which required large amounts of mineral coal. 5. Takashima didn't only have had to deal with a great demand of coal from other places around the world, it was also under pressure to change its extraction methods and thus have a greater production capacity. With the importation of British machinery and engineers, mining went from being superficial and artisanal to a modern system of vertical drilling that, in April 1869, reached a mineral bed 45 meters below ground. This is how the first coal mine was established in Japan. 6. Takashima's great success and the large amount of foreign money circulating prompted the search for coal in some of the 550 islands of Nagasaki Prefecture, among them the nearby Hashima, an uninhabited rock fragment with just over 1 square kilometer of extension. After a few failed attempts, in 1887 the Fukuhara family installed the first mine in Hashima, which 3 years later was sold for 100,000 yens to the already famous Mitsubishi Corporation, a company that had expanded rapidly since its founding in 1873 as a shipping company and then bought the Takashima coal mine in 1881. 7. Hashima Island, located about 20 kilometers from the port of Nagasaki and with a length of 480 meters and a width of 150, was inhabited between 1887 and 1974 by workers of the coal mines and their families. In 1959 the island reached a population density of 139,100 persons/km2 in residential areas and 83,500 persons/km2 on its whole surface. This is one of the highest population densities registered in the world. 8. During the wars between China and Japan, Japan and Russia, and the First and Second World War, Hashima mines worked normally. It went from producing 15,000 tons of coal per year in the first decade of the 20th century, to 410,000 yearly tons in 1941. To achieve this, Mitsubishi drilled two vertical tunnels that reached the seabed at a depth close to 199 meters between 1885 and 1889. The island was at the same time a mine and a city for almost 100 years. Industrial facilities were located on the flat areas reclaimed from the sea. And over the years, and as a response to the very high population density, more than 30 residential buildings made of reinforced concrete were built in the rocky interior, connected by a passage network, patios, corridors and staircases. It is said that in 1916, in Hashima, one of the first Japanese reinforced concrete building with many levels was built. It was resistant to time, the sea and typhoons. Its interior spaces were simple small rooms that usually shared bathrooms and kitchens. In hand with these housing complexes, several infrastructures were built. An aqueduct that carried drinking water by the seabed from Nagasaki, a hospital, a school, a gymnasium, a cinema, a theater, bars, restaurants, shops, beauty salons and temples. While Mitsubishi's manager lived in a private house in the highest part of the island and the high-rank engineers lived with their families in apartments with independent service facilities, the workers lived in shared service facilities apartments, and the foreign workers, Chinese and Korean, lived like slaves. It is said that in 1945, coinciding with the end of World War II, over 1,300 workers had died due to the hard working conditions in the tunnels, diseases and malnutrition. In the 60s, some islanders carried fertile soil from other coastal areas in order to cultivate on their roofs and have plants and gardens because the island's mineral soil was not good for this. As a matter of fact, all the food always arrived by ship from other ports, so when the weather conditions didn't allow navigating, food was scarce. 10. By the end of the 70s, with a failing Japanese economy and the imminent replacement of coal for oil as a government policy, the coal mines were shut down one by one. Mitsubishi made a personnel reduction and transferred workers to other branches of its industries. On January 15, 1974, the company announced the closing of the mine during a ceremony at the island's gym, at which time it offered jobs to whoever wanted to move. This way Hashima was completely abandoned in little over 3 months. 11. After its abandonment, the island's buildings have gradually deteriorated due to the constant exposure to salinity and other weather forces. Fragments of paint, stucco, walls and broken windows live with tricycles or TVs from the 60s, showing the sudden disappearance of the community who once lived there. In 2005, Nagasaki was given jurisdiction over the island, and since April 22, 2009, some of its areas have been opened to tourism after 35 years of closure. Although to open the entire island to tourism would involve great investments and improvements to the structures currently falling apart, and that represents a great risk to the visitors. Some independent organizations along with the Japanese government have proposed that the island be designated by the UNESCO as an industrial heritage of humanity, but South Korea is opposed to this because it claims that during World War II the mining facilities turned its citizens into slaves. 12. The decay of the concrete buildings was monitored for the filming of History Channel's miniseries Life After People. The island is also featured in a few films: Battle Royale 2, Requiem, and the manga Air Gear, the anime picture Get Backers, and The Last James Bond. Skyfall, the documentary made by Thomas Nordenstad, uploaded to YouTube in 2011, tells the story of a native man from Hashima that after some time returned to the island, to his apartment, and remembers his life and childhood there. Caddisfly shelters. Caddisflies, order Trichoptera, are insects with complete metamorphosis that pass through the egg, larva, pupa and adult phases, and that are related to butterflies and moths. During the larval and pupate phases, which occur underwater, caddisflies build transitional shelters to protect themselves from a diversity of predators. Due to their diversity and abundance, caddisflies are considered the most important order of aquatic insects. They are present in every aquatic ecosystem, except for the Antarctica, and play a fundamental role in the food chain of energy gain that allows growth. In the American tropics there are approximately 2,197 species, classified in 153 genera and 24 families, of which 13 live in Colombia, represented by 210 species. The fact that 24 families live in just the neotropics is an indicator of the very high morphological and ecological variability that occurs between species. Hence, although their shelters basically display a similar tubular configuration, built from small pieces bound to each other, they exhibit a great variety in other aspects like dimensions, geometry and materials. After being used, shelters return to the waterbed and dissolve. Adult caddisflies live on land. They can fly and they lay their eggs near water. Larvae resemble caterpillars, and by means of a modified salivary gland that enables them to produce silk, they can adhere or cling to a substrate, build water-filtering webs for feeding, or build shelters by gluing together grains of collected sand, silica, rocks, organic particles, sticks, leaves and minerals. Pupae develop inside the shelter, either by modifying the larval shelter or by building a new one, and finally move to the shore to emerge as adults. The wide diversity of caddisfly species has three main forms of life. In the first, larvae move freely, leaving a silk thread behind them to move. These only build a shelter before becoming pupae. In the second, larvae and pupae are sedentary and build shelters that can be attached to a substrate from which they feed, or obtain their food through specialized silk webs. In the third and more widespread form, the insect is motile all along. From the larval stage, it builds a portable case that allows it to move in search of food. Some portable shelters exhibit hydrostatic, flotation, or hydrodynamic, movement, functions, depending on the water current or its stagnation. Some static shelters free the insect's hind legs to allow it to hunt. A quick glance reveals morphological variations in the shelters which are linked to their degree of permeability, to current direction, or to anchoring to the substrate. Shelters can be straight, funneled, curved, flat, coiled or even form a spiral. In each of these three forms of life, differences lie in the design of the silk devices and its specific adaptations that increase the number of species able to use a habitat's resources, dividing space in a multiplicity of functions. This means that caddisfly diversity results from the partition of space or niche into particular functions, achieved through variations in the technical tool employed by the insect. The spatial dimension, the construction of shelters or webs, is the most complex aspect of the life of caddisflies. Opposing neighborhoods. On the eastern slopes of Medellin there are two very different cases of urban growth. The first one, to the north of the city, constitutes a self-organization phenomenon, consisting of two neighborhoods, Santo Domingo Savio 1 and 2, that make part of Zone 1, and house an important portion of the working class. The second case, to the south, refers to an expansion phenomenon through a process of real estate speculation, which comprises a luxury bubble. This hub is formed by quarters like El Tesoro, Los Balsos or San Lucas, which belong to Zone 14 El Poblado, and houses the higher income class. Both urban growth processes associate to circumstances of violence, rural guerrillas, drug dealing and paramilitaries, that evidence inequity and the gaps between human groups living in Medellin. These two neighborhoods located on the same mountainside, although sharing ecological and topographical conditions, show opposite degrees of social and urban permeabilities. Santo Domingo Neighborhood 1 and 2. These are self-constructed neighborhoods that were built by their dwellers, and in which houses are consolidated step by step. In the neighborhoods, life conditions improve with time, and engagement in regularization processes such as obtaining public services is gradual. There are few main roads, but in return, there is an extensive network of passages and connecting trails. Every block is divided into irregular plots that connect to the street. This occurs by adapting to the changing slope, which implies the construction of nooks, bridges and flights of stairs. Every construction has a variable number of accesses and perforations. These neighborhoods are complex three-dimensional configurations that articulate growth in three levels: terraces, balconies and roofs. It could be said that this architecture is constantly in process. It is never finished and is therefore open, and that it gives way to change and extension. The clearest example of such a concept is expressed in the diverse use of the concrete slab roofs. Besides being terraces awaiting future activity, becoming a home for a son, for instance, they are used for drying clothes, for growing plants, keeping pets, throwing family parties, among other possible uses. On the other hand, extreme poverty or space and financial limitations trigger very serious social problems. Nevertheless, solidarity and cohesion among neighbors makes survival possible, enabled by a constant contact between people, on the street or in a more general way through an intense use of public space. The diversity living within these neighborhoods is urban as well as material. Wide aesthetics allow a heterogeneous use of materials, of finishes and veneers. Plaster could be jagged, smooth, with circular depressions or with different textures. Veneers include the use of stone, ceramics and metals. Colors include tones from pastel to neon, and are freely combined. Social inequity and marginalization trigger conditions for gang emergence in Santo Domingo, where they make a living from illegal drug and weapon trafficking. Permeability of the neighborhood and the chance of escaping through many different routes help this situation. Despite the high physical porosity, invisible barriers arise, which are hard to dissolve. Permeability. There is also a delicate and vulnerable quality. State presence in the area has increased over the last decade. The Plan Urbano Integral Urban Plan, which articulates public transport systems, metro cable, new cultural and educational buildings, España Library, Santo Domingo Kindergarten and Santo Domingo School, public space system, and sports facilities. Under this framework, existing houses have been improved or new ones have been built, all with a social background that involves vulnerable communities and that is founded on expanding education and labor opportunity coverage. El Tesoro, Los Balsos and San Lucas in Zone 14 El Poblado, the south of the eastern mountainside that constitutes today a big portion of El Poblado, remained a rural area that was distant from the city for over 2 centuries. Little by little, Cottages became recreational houses and later country house suburbs. Starting in the 1970s, the area has been experiencing a rapid transformation process in which private developers build high-rise buildings and surround them in fences and surveillance booths. These buildings, retracted from the perimeter, constitute, at least in part, an idea of luxury and fine living that is promoted in Medellin. This suburb was encouraged by the violence brought about by drug dealing, but it is also a local interpretation of the North American suburb, of fear of poverty and of difference. Gardens, pools and some minor buildings are set between the enclosing fence and the tall buildings. A surveillance booth constitutes the only contact point with the outside. Shared areas within the residential development lack the urban vitality distinctive of public places, therefore social relations are postponed for the shopping mall. A repeated construction of this model, mixed with large amounts of native vegetation, consolidates a vast, but impracticable, garden city. Curiously enough, an increasing emphasis of ecology-oriented speeches are part of the advertising strategies of real estate agencies, and this only causes real ecological problems of the neighborhood to be even more obvious: a high consumption of fossil fuels, a rare use of public transport, an outrageous expansion of the city, water pollution, etc. The materials used for these buildings are usually homogeneous, of high quality and low diversity. Exteriors are made in red bricks, the interiors plastered and painted white. Design intends to resist wearing in time and avoid changes. Important transformations are not allowed, nor are material variations or individual expressions. Even hanging clothes to dry on the balcony is considered an assault to your neighbor. In order to even conceive a future transformation of these neighborhoods, massive removal of fences, a subdivision of interior spaces and the requalification of facades to allow a greater diversity of families, are all necessary actions that could lead to closing the city's social gap. The fear of violence and maybe an interest in consolidating as an educated and productive group that stands apart from problems and social dispute leads inhabitants of El Poblado to live a segregated life within a well-defined neighborhood. Impermeability of the neighborhoods within Zone 14 contributes to the waves of urban violence in Medellin. A phenomenon that contradicts this statement emerges: the mass use of the bikeway set on El Poblado Avenue on Sunday mornings, one of the main roads in the sector, is exclusively available for pedestrians and cyclists, and is connected to other bike lanes throughout the rest of the city. Inhabitants of the area gather along it, a manifestation that is consolidated as a massive phenomenon of social and urban permeability. Exchange of doors and windows. Medellin has been growing towards the municipalities located on the eastern plateau of Antioquia. These lie, on average, at 2,125 meters above sea level and have an annual average temperature of 17 degrees Celsius. Many people work in Medellin and travel during 45 minutes every day, by car or bus, to get to their homes on this plateau, to Rio Negro, La Ceiba, El Retiro, El Carmen or Garn. Many others leave the city for the weekends to go to their country house in this sector, or even go there for a stroll. New urban developments gather around the consolidated urban perimeters of these towns, but the whole area has also unfolded as an extensive suburb of low-rise houses on big lots with carefully controlled perimeters, fences and surveillance booths. This situation foresees upcoming social and ecological problems: high levels of deforestation, a lack of public spaces, vehicle pollution, dubious urban planning, emigration of peasants to the city, a disproportionate rise in the price of land, and potable water shortages. Over the last few years, and in the middle of this phenomenon of urban expansion, several businesses that offer second-hand products for the construction of new houses have emerged. Some sell handcrafted doors and windows, fabricated in the early 20th century with high-quality woods of native species that, according to the Libro Rojo de Plantas de Colombia, the Red Book of Colombian plants, are now critically endangered. An example of this is the Camino Crespo, Anida Perutalis Hamzel CRA2CD, of which extraction, for any purpose, is banned by law. Interestingly, these architectural fragments originate at the demolition and disuse of houses that were built during the same period, in the department of Boyacá, on the eastern Cordillera, more than 500 kilometers by road from Rio Negro, where these fragments are now sold. A door made of Camino Crespo measuring 2.40 by 1.20 meters can cost US $400. This price includes transportation from the city of Tunja in Boyacá, but does not include the price of transportation to the new construction site, nor its installation. These businesses are also carpentries in which products are adapted and refurbished according to the buyer's needs. The exchange of parts and reuse of architectural fragments carried out in these shops prevent deforestation. In some cases, these may accelerate the destruction of traditional houses, a process brought about by economic pressure intrinsic to the business, and in other cases, these may offer a second life or chance to find fragments that lost their initial use. These fragments can incorporate new architectures because of their physical qualities and of the high-quality artisanal processes by which they were created. In this case, the interchangeable fragments are doors, blinds and windows, simple devices that provide permeability to architecture. In other similar cases, fragments moved from one architecture to another can be tiles, veneers, bricks, roof tiles, beams or columns, which participate in the structure of the building or in the forming of its facades and finishes. To lose or to incorporate parts is understood here as a quality that implies the mixture of diverse technologies and times of fabrication and use. Not every material in a project should belong to just one constructive nature, not all of them should be new or be destined for a single purpose, and many of them could serve for future use. Phenotypic plasticity. In biology, the concept of phenotype plasticity exists to refer to the change of characteristics of an organism in response to an environmental signal. If genotype refers to the genetic information of any organism, the phenotype is the expression of the genotype in a particular environment. Generally speaking, plasticity is the property of that which can change its shape and preserve it permanently, although in this case, the phenotypic plasticity is the property of a genotype to produce more than one phenotype when the organism is found in different environmental conditions. Factors such as photoperiod, seasonal variation, temperature, humidity or pH, among others, determine these changes, which can be expressed as chemical, physiological, development, morphological, conduct, etc. Changes in response to the variation of these environmental signals. Phenotypic plasticity is the result of numerous physiological mechanisms, including transcription, translation, enzymatic regulation and hormonal, which produce local or systemic responses. The genotype doesn't have the ability to generate an infinite number of phenotypes before the variables mentioned. On the contrary, it has a limited number as response. It's flexible but has restrictions, and its changes can be detonated quickly during the life of an organism. during its development, or can even become adaptive changes throughout a medium or long period of a species. The adaptive plasticity is the tendency of a genotype to express a phenotype which increases its ability to survive and reproduce in a given environment. If a genotype is a combination of genes which changes or is modified slowly, the phenotype is the combination of features that express the limited and latent flexibility of the genotype. A good example of phenotype plasticity is seen in some social insects, communities which depend on the division of its members in distinguished classes, like workmen and soldiers. The wide difference between the individuals of the different classes isn't only in its physical features but also in its behavior. The genome of each individual contains all the instructions necessary to develop itself in any of the forms, but only the genes that are part of the development program are activated. In this case, the differences depend on the way the queen and its workmen treat the eggs, manipulating factors such as the diet or temperature of incubation. In this particular case, the construction of the ants or termites' nest is understood as a part of the behavioral characteristic of the species, and in this respect its constructive capacity and even the architectural variables of its buildings are part of the phenotypic flexibility. Architecture carried out by human communities is determined in large part by aspects of behavior which vary very slowly. For this reason, the architectural program of a house, for instance, is usually conservative and with barely any change. On the contrary, the use and adaptation of our buildings is usually plastic, limited, but flexible. What implications are there in thinking of architecture as an extension of the plasticity of our phenotype?